Hey, so I know it's been a while since I've made a video on here, but I figured the time was at hand to make another video, and this time it's actually about time, and more particularly God's relation to time, and even more specifically, whether or not God created time. So we're going to try to get through a lot of, information here in a short period of time, um, which may be a little bit difficult, so I want to apologize ahead of time if I make this a bit longer than I intended, but try to keep it short. Okay, so right now, the question is whether or not God created time. And this, video was kind of prompted by a discussion with somebody else on YouTube in which this came up. And the question is, what would be the negative effects of believing that God created time? And so that's basically what we're going to be discussing. I believe that God did not create time, but time is just a essential part or necessary aspect of existence, and so therefore he didn't have to. So we're going to look at a few aspects of this. First, let's kind of discuss the purpose of this, because in a discussion like this, when we're talking about things like did God create time or God's relation to time, it may sound extremely theoretical and extremely philosophical. And that's not our purpose here. Our purpose, believe it or not, is a very practical one. And the reason for this is because of the philosophy that has come into our paradigm of thinking, particularly as Christians, and also Jews and Muslims have this same concept as well. Because of that, there have been many practical results that have come out of that, which are actually quite negative, and it affects things like prayer, whether or not we can relate to God, whether or not God is personal or impersonal, and well, it kind of relates to a lot of other things which are harder to explain until we kind of get into it. So first we just have to look at the issue and seek the truth on it. So again, this whole thing, not for the purpose of philosophy or theoretic rhetoric, it's more so for practical purposes. So I want to ask you to bear with me as we go through some of the logical process of this that may seem more theoretical and philosophical, because at the end it is intensely practical what the outcome of this will be. So the other thing that we need to do before we begin into this is define time, because I don't want you to think that we're talking about God's relation to time in terms of the measurement of time. We're not talking about seconds, minutes, hours, days, weeks, months, years, or any other measurement of time. We're talking about time itself. So the distinction is this: all a measurement of time is something that is cyclical, or something that is repeating on a consistent basis. That creates a measurement. We have this with spatial things too, right? We have a ruler, and you could have a line on the ruler at any interval, really. And, we have one space that's like this, and, we keep going, and we have an equal spacing, and we call those, inches or whatever it may be. So you have something that is consistent and repeating, and there you have measurements. So we're not talking about the measurement of time. We're talking about time itself. And let's just quickly define that with the first definition on dictionary.com. I thought they did a pretty good job of defining this. And I ask you to take the time to kind of try to digest what this is saying. So it's defining time as this: the system of sequential relations that any event has to any other, as past, present, or future. Indefinite and continuous duration regarded as that in which events succeed one another. So again, take the time to digest that, but I'm going to give a quick example of something without defining time to try and tie us back into that and understand more so what time is. Okay, so we have something called simultaneity, and what that is simply two events taking place at the same time. So snap both my fingers, both hands, and that was simultaneous. So that's simultaneity. But when I do that, that's non-simultaneity. Those two things did not take place at the same time. So those are two events, right? One event, two event. And those didn't take place at the same time, right? Neither of those events in themselves, or even together, are time, right? But time is the indefinite and continuous duration regarded as that in which events succeed one another. So time is the thing in which that took place, right? It's the system of subsequent relations that any event, one, has to any other, two, right? So that's time. We're talking about time itself. So the question is, did God create time? And so, again, the purpose is one of the things that we're looking at, and why we're confining our discussion not to the whole broadness of God's relation to time, but whether or not God created time, is because we're simply trying to see what the negative effects could be of believing that God did create time. So again, I believe that God did not create time. It's just part of the necessary conditions of existence, and therefore he didn't have to. Now, someone might object to that right away and say, well, God created everything, so he had to have created time. So let's briefly examine that, and then we'll go through kind of the bulk of what this video is aimed at. We might ask if God created truth. Now, likewise with time, I'm not talking about truth as in something that is true. Because anyone who is religious would say that God, whatever he created, became true, right? He created something and it was true. So in that sense, God did create truth. But we're not talking in terms of individual things or things that are true, because those are things. We're talking about truth itself. Now, what truth is simply, and you can look this up in any dictionary, actually for that I'll give you another example of what truth is. I'll say that myself, as I'm making this video, am indoors. I'm inside of a building. Now, the question is that true? Well, I think anyone here that's looking around here will say, well, yeah, that's true. Now, what would make that not true? Well, simply if I wasn't in a building, right? If I was outside and I said that same thing, it wouldn't be true. And the thing that made the difference is what is actually the fact of the matter, what is real. And so truth is simply reality. Truth is simply the fact of the matter, right? So when we consider that and we ask, well, did God create truth itself? If he did, that would mean at one point it wasn't in existence and he had to create it. But if truth wasn't in existence and God had to create it, that would mean that God existed, but truth didn't. You see the problem there? If truth is synonymous with reality and fact and existence, and if there was always a reality, then time, or that truth, had to have always have existed. Because it's just the same thing, right? If God always existed, truth always existed, it was unnecessary for him to have to create such a thing as truth. So, because of that, we can say, okay, well, perhaps it's fair to say God created everything, but perhaps everything is within a certain scope of, there's only a certain scope of words that we use that describe what is included in everything within that context. Within another context, perhaps it's accurate to say God did not create everything, such as existence, reality, truth. And there's a few more things that perhaps we'll be making videos on in the future along those lines of things. But, that's the whole purpose of that illustration with truth, is just to say, well, we shouldn't really just say God had to create time because God created everything, because he didn't have to create truth. So the question is really, is time just a necessary part of existence, or is it something that had to be created? Again, time itself. So the question, did God create time? Now, the theory or the belief that the majority of the religious world believes at this time is that, yes, God did create time, right? Because, well, he created everything. and he's outside of time. We have all these pictures, that God is outside of time. Now, the thing that we're going to look at is, okay, suppose that is true. What does that imply? If God created time at one point, that would mean that God existed in a realm of non-time, right? And as we discussed before, non-simultaneity is proof that time exists. So in that non-time that God would have existed in, and as we'll find must still exist in, which is the Christian thought anyways, and the Jewish and the Islamic thought, that God exists outside of time, then in that external experience from time, there would be no simultaneity, right? Or, sorry, I should not say that there's no simultaneity, there's complete simultaneity, because you can't have succession with no time, right? So everything would be simultaneous. And what that means, of course, is that there could be no action, there could be no thought, there could be no, nothing like that. Everything would have to be at the same time. So, if God does exist, or had existed, or however you want to put it, in a non-time, God would have to be completely simultaneous with everything. In other words, considering the mind of God, either God would be thinking absolutely nothing, right? Or God would be thinking absolutely everything, or God would be thinking some thoughts but not all thoughts, right? So those are kind of just three possibilities, and we're going to kind of consider each. And basically, I should say, no thoughts, some thoughts, all thoughts. The first one of those, God thinking no thoughts, no one really believes that, because, well, if God exists in this non-time focused reality with no thoughts, we kind of have no means by which to attribute even the term God to that, whatever that would be. No thoughts, right? And of course, no thoughts, you basically end up with no God, and no, certainly the God of the Bible is not thoughtless, right? Like it says in Isaiah 55, his thoughts are above our thoughts, and his ways above our ways. So God has thoughts. Now, the other thing would be to say that God was existing some of the thoughts simultaneously, but he was not then thinking every thought. And the only reason why someone might suggest that is because of the problems that come in with the third option of God thinking every thought at once. But, and for that reason, no one really, as far as I know, holds to the view that God was simultaneously thinking some thoughts but not all. But let's just consider what that would mean. So we have God outside of time, and let's say, I'll just take this post-it notepad and just say that this, let's say this is a box, right? And within this box here, this is time. So we have God outside of time, and in this box is time, right? So if God's out here, and he's thinking some thoughts, and it's all simultaneous, so it's not thought, it's just he's thinking thoughts that are not no thoughts, and it's not every possible thought, thinking some thoughts, and then here's this thing of time. And so God, in order for God to think all his thoughts, if he's not thinking all of them out here, he must enter into the box in order to think those thoughts. Now what that would mean is that God, in order to think every thought, had to create a box to confine himself in so he could think more, right? Or think better. And hopefully you can see already that's starting to not make sense, right? So God has this box, let's say, enters into it, and now, okay, so you have God, and apparently God's still out here in this non-time, but also in this time. So if being in this time enables him to think all thoughts, then in here he's thinking all thoughts, and in that case, the part of God which is in time is aware of the part of God which is outside of time, right? But the part of God which is outside of time is unable to think the thoughts of the God that's, or the part of God that's inside time, which is why I had to go in. And that's the problem with thinking that part of God is outside of time, thinking some thoughts simultaneously without thinking all thoughts simultaneously. Because in order to have all thoughts, you have to divide God into two parts, one of which, the part outside of time, is unable to comprehend the thoughts of the part of God which is in time. So you have that would be a double-minded God. So that's why, as far as I know, no one believes that, but we want to kind of cover all bases here. So we know, okay, so if God created time, and God does exist in this non-time, we know that he couldn't have been thinking nothing, and God couldn't have been thinking some thoughts, but not all thoughts. So the third option is God thinking every thought simultaneously. And this is what some people actually do believe. Now let's consider the implications of that. Let's just, again, use this box as an example of X. This could be anything. It could be the box of time. It could be this world. It could be me. It could be you. It could be really anything, right? Now, in order for God to think all thoughts, if he's outside of this box, outside of time, let's say, that means he would be out here and he's thinking all thoughts. He would be currently, or he would be then and currently, thinking, I am about to create this box, I am currently creating this box, and I already have created this box. Now, you have a few options there. Once you have that, of God thinking all those thoughts simultaneously, I'm about to, I am currently, and I have, right? Past, present, future, concerning this one thing, you have a few options, or two options that I'm aware of at least. First, that all those thoughts are not true, or all those thoughts are true. And again, as far as I know, no one holds to the belief that some of God's thoughts aren't true. So that needs to be addressed less, but again, we'll address it anyways. So let's say one of those thoughts was true. Let's say God was about to create this box, and that was true. He was about to, but he was thinking every thought. So he also thought he was currently creating it and already had created it. Now, if that was true, of course, he's self-deceived, as well as totally ignorant of when the thing actually takes place. Because if he's thinking those thoughts at once, but only one of them is true, when it actually becomes true and passes from one to the other, he wouldn't know any different, because he already thinks that all of them are true. So, again, that makes God quite unrelatable, right? Because he already thinks that everything has already happened, and everything's about to happen, and it hasn't happened yet, and everything is currently happening, right? And knows no difference one way or the other. Now, the other thought is that all those things are true. Now, what would be the implications of that? If it was true that this box was about to be created by God, was currently being created by God, and had already been created by God, all this, again, in the in the complete simultaneity before the creation of time. Now, what that would mean is, if all those thoughts were true, that he actually had already, and was currently already, and was about to already create everything, and do everything, and think everything at every single point in time in the story of the universe. Now, what that would mean is that before God created time, in this non-time in which God supposedly exists, God already had created the world, had already created you and me, and was currently creating the world, and was currently creating you and me, and currently about to. Now, what that would mean, since God couldn't have had a thought before that in this complete simultaneity, right? Because once you have non-simultaneity, you have time. What that would mean is that we are just as eternal as God, right? Because it was true that he already had created us, right? So you can kind of see some of the problems there. And the other thing with that is that if this is before he created time, that that really didn't allow him the ability to actually do any of that. In which case, the only way in which all those things could be true, past, present, and future, would be for all of us and everything to only exist in the mind of God, right? Because the only means by which we would exist in that complete simultaneity, if it was, true that it was about to be created, currently being created, and already had been created, is it to be simply his mental construct, right? So we would all just be part of the mind of God. Now, what this does is creates basically one avenue of getting to the theology or philosophy of pantheism, which is basically saying that God is everything, right? Everything is God, God is everything, God is in everything. Basically no distinction between the creator and the created. Now, this has a number of issues with it. One thing is that the devil, in that case, would only be an expression of God, right? An expression of the mind of God. And we would only be an expression of the mind of God, and everything that exists and everything that happens is only another part of the mind of God. Now, what that would mean is if we hold God to be good, that we'd have to count everything as good, even the devil, even the worst sins out there, even the murdering of little children, and the rest of it. We'd have to count that good if we count God good. Or if we look at the reality of life and recognize not everything is good, and most things in this world aren't, then what we'd end up having to conclude is that God is not all good, and God has wickedness as part of him. Or we would conclude that there's no basis for deciding what is good and what is not good, in which case everything becomes totally amoral, right? So you can see kind of some of the issues there. The other thing that ends up happening is that you have total. If God was thinking every thought at once and everything was always true, right? Past, present, and future. Every thought of God was always true and thinking every thought at once, and we always existed and always were about to exist and always had already existed. Sin would never be eradicated from the universe. And the universe, in fact, would be totally static. There's no possibility of change. Everything is complete simultaneity. And when there's no possibility of change and everything is completely static, there's no free will whatsoever, right? In other words, there's no choice that I can make if everything is already totally set, and the future is just as much the present as the present is then, if you get what I mean by that. It's, you end up with a lot of kind of warped things going on there. And with this no free will, that would include us and God, since, of course, we would just be part of the mind of God. Now, what that would mean is that if there's no free will, again, with no free will, there can be no love, right? Love has to be by choice. You can't force love. If there's no free will, there's no love. If there's no free will, there's no nobility, there's nothing that's praiseworthy. And when we look at God, and people say, oh, praise God, or something like that, if God and existence is this static thing with no free will, which would be necessary if God did create time, as we are finding out, that means that God never made any choice. Everything that God does, he's forced to do. So, for example, if you go online and find one of these online contests or whatever, not even a contest, but just you enter into a draw and to win a prize. And the computer just randomly selects a name from this list of however many thousands of people, and you end up being the prize winner. Now, are you going to be able to honestly praise the computer? Well, no, because the computer didn't know any different. It didn't choose you because of anything it feels for you or anything like that. It was a total random choice, right? The computer did not choose anything by will, right? So, because of that, you can't respect or honor or consider the computer to be noble. Likewise with God, if God was not a free moral agent, if God was confined to do everything that was done in this static existence with no free will, there's nothing praiseworthy there. There's nothing worthy of honor. So, there's a number of issues there. But to kind of continue on that, there's I guess a number of different issues related to that aspect of free will that goes down a whole nother train of thought that we won't really get into. But one of the things that's connected with that, with God not being a free moral agent and being in this completely static existence, is where you have no choice, and when you have no change, you can have no personality, right? No choice, no change, no personality. Now, what that does is, with God being impersonal, that's a very practical thing, is it not? If God is impersonal, how can we relate to God, right? And in fact, how can we be personal, And so you can see how viewing it this way, let's say if indeed God is personal, but we, through our philosophy of God's relation to time, even on a subconscious level, through that, end up thinking that God is impersonal because, just so distant, so beyond time and all that, then we can't relate to this God. If God actually is personal and we are thinking the wrong thoughts in that regard, that's going to be quite damaging. We won't be able to have that relationship with God that we're supposed to have. So, anyways, the other thing with God being impersonal is, if God is impersonal and God is static, there's no means by which to attribute personhood to God. Now, God, even the word God is designating a divine person or a divine being. And if that's the case, and if God is not personal, by what means do we call God God? We really can't. We can't even, if we have this impersonal, static existence with no actual personality, you can't even really classify that as an entity of any sort. So, we'll kind of come back to that in a little bit here, but one of the things that people will say about this is that they will kind of say, well, you're limiting God. When you say that God didn't create time, you are limiting God. And the reason why they say that is because, of course, they believe that God did create time, and that makes him seem more powerful, right? So when you say God didn't create time, you're saying that there was something there that coexisted with God for eternity, right? Which we already saw is the case with truth, just to keep that in mind. But, it's, you're limiting God, because, you're removing that power of him over time, right? Now, the problem with that is people say, well, okay, you're limiting God, and you're claiming to know the mind of God, and all this sort of thing. But the problem is, once you say anything about God, you're basically limiting God. If you're saying that God did create time, we've already seen that you end up creating all these limitations, right? And just go back over the video so far if you want to kind of think about it in those terms and see, okay, well, it couldn't be like this, couldn't be like that, it would have had to be like this, and we're following this train, and we start with this broad thing, and we narrow. We're coming down and just following the thought and canceling out all these options as we go, and we're going to see if it comes to a dead end or if it actually goes through. And so far, I think you see where this is going. Now, we can see that going down that road is limiting or narrowing, God, with believing that God did create time. So anything you say about God, you could just accuse someone of limiting God. If someone says God is 3 persons, well, how about why isn't God 4 persons or 8 persons or 16 persons or whatever? Are you just limiting God? Or if you say, oh, God is the God of Israel, well, are you limiting it to God not being the God of everything else? Or if you say, basically anything that you say about God could be taken as limiting God. But, so the point is, it doesn't really work to just use that accusation, because that could be turned right back on your own perspective. So let's just avoid doing all that and just simply seek the truth on this without trying to accuse people of trying to limit this or limit that. Now, the other thing that people will do as they go through this, and they can see how irrational it is when followed to its logical conclusions to believe that God did create time, they'll say, well, it doesn't matter if it's rational or not, our minds are just too puny, and uh, it's just incomprehensible. It's incomprehensible, so it doesn't have to make sense. Therefore, God did create time, right? The problem with that, again, is you could use that either way and say, well, it's just incomprehensible, and our minds are too puny, therefore God didn't create time. It doesn't really do anything one way or the other than, in other words, it's kind of a pseudo argument for propping up something which you recognize there's no logical basis for. But what do you have to do in order to say something and simply say that it is incomprehensible and but true nonetheless? What do you have to do in order to be able to make that claim? How do you get to something that is incomprehensible and then simply assert it as truth? Well, let's just say that I had a colorless red apple. I want you to try and imagine that right now. Can you imagine a colorless red apple? Well, hopefully you can see, well, no, I can't really imagine that. The reason why is because that is what we call, a contradiction. And what that is simply doing is asserting one thing and the negation of that same thing and asserting them both to be true at the same time, right? Now that simply can't be, because if you have something that is colorless, by definition, it's not any color, it's colorless. If you have something that is red, by definition, it has color. So you can't have something that is colorless and red at the same time. A colorless red apple, right? Now, what if I told you that I have this colorless red apple, and it doesn't matter if it doesn't make sense because it's incomprehensible. It's an incomprehensible colorless red apple. Well, that's simply me just saying that I know it doesn't make sense, but I want to believe it anyways, right? So that's the same thing when we say, oh, reason doesn't matter, logic doesn't matter, understanding doesn't matter. It's just incomprehensible regardless of the fact that it contradicts each other. And all we're really doing when we say, oh, this is incomprehensible and it doesn't matter if it's logical or not because it's incomprehensible, it's true anyways, all that we're really doing is admitting that it's a contradiction and we want to believe it anyways. That's all we're really doing there. So again, I'm just bringing these things up for you to consider and ask, well, why are you even holding on to this thing anyways? If it actually doesn't make sense, why go with it? And there's a number of things in the Bible, won't go through it now, but Isaiah 118, for example, God says, come, let us reason together, right? We're told to reason, we're told to think. We're not supposed to be thoughtless and just believing traditions. And the other thing is, there's nowhere in the Bible, that says that God created time. So why spend, a lot of time trying to defend that when, first of all, it's not there, and second of all, it just simply doesn't make sense. So anyways, kind of to go back to some of the implications of believing this, we already found that if you follow the logical train of thought from God being existent in a non-time and the necessary conditions of that, and how we would be just part of God and the rest of it, and existence would be static, God would be impersonal and unrelatable. The other thing to consider is that if God was actually not personal, not a person, and unrelatable, by what means do we call that thought, or those thoughts that are apparently simultaneous, even thoughts? How do we call them thoughts? To consider along with this as well is, if God was thinking every thought simultaneously, there's really no means by which we can distinguish between one thought and the next. Is it really just a whole bunch of thoughts? Or is it perhaps just, you could equally say that it is just one very complex thought? So if you have this totally impersonal, static, non-free-willed, um, basically non-entity, how do you, call that a person? And since you can't call it a person, how does it have this thought? And it's only thinking this one thing, but that thing that it's thinking is everything, and that is just simply existence. So we are just the thoughts. So what that would do is create a pantheism in which basically the title of God becomes an arbitrary title placed upon existence, but there is no actual entity. And the logical, in other words, the logical conclusion when followed all the way through to the end is atheism, right? Because you end up with this, the only way by which to call anything still God at that point is by complete arbitrary assignment. And still, even then, under the definitions of God, it doesn't even work. That's just like, well, you could call the whole thing boot, or you could call the whole thing any made up phonetic, kind of assembly of phonetics. Doesn't really, doesn't really make sense. So what that should let us know, since when you follow the thought of God existing outside of time to its logical conclusions, when you follow that all the way through and find out that the logical conclusion of that is atheism, basically that proves that a God outside of time cannot exist, right? Hopefully that makes sense to you, and if it doesn't, please, you can watch the video again or send me a note or comment or whatever, and we can discuss that. And I hope you can see the implications of that in the practical life. And it kind of attaches itself to a whole lot of other things. Now, again, there are other aspects of this which I haven't addressed and won't be addressing in this video, which I may make other videos dealing with, but basically the thought there, what that whole line of reasoning did was show that it simply cannot be true that God exists outside of time, right? And therefore God could not have created time, because necessarily then he would be outside of it. So time is just one of those necessary parts of the universe, or of existence even, I should say. Now there's a whole other way to look at this, a number of other ways, but we could look at this even without even discussing the aspect of God, just the aspect of time, whether it's static or not. Now if God, again, we already found out that it's necessary for time and all existence to be truly static if God created time. Now, if that's true and we have a static existence, what that would mean, and again, I'm only going through this part here as a side note to kind of give another perspective of the same thing. If time is static, that would mean that the experience that we have of time is an illusion, right? And not only, and here's the other thing, is if the experience of time is an illusion, then everything that we experience in time is only part of that illusion. So what that would mean is our entire experience, our entire everything is an illusion. Even the thought process of coming to the conclusion or believing that God created time. Do you see how it falls on itself? Because if we believe that it's static, our whole experience is a complete illusion, and therefore even our thought that God created time would necessarily be an illusion. Right? You can have no logic and no reasoning in a static universe. And so basically, it falls on itself in that respect along that line of things. And now here, shifting a little bit, there's another way in which it really falls on itself. And what that is basically, here's how we know that our experience of time cannot be an illusion. Now I'll use another word here simply because it's easier to explain, and that's deception, because illusion and deception is the same thing. And within this kind of construct of what we're talking about, I'm not necessarily using it in a sinister sense. because it would be impersonal. The whole existence would be impersonal, so it wouldn't be sinister because there'd be really no such thing as sinister. But using it in the sense of being deceived into thinking falsehood, right? Illusion. But I'll use the word deception in here for explanatory purposes. What that would mean, again, we have, if our whole experience is an illusion, the way that we know that that's not true is because in order for us to be deceived, deception is part of that experience of becoming, right? In other words, in order for me to even be deceived into that, there has to be a deception, and deception has to act upon the individual, right? In order for it to even be a deception, somebody has to be deceived, and that's temporal. That is a time necessary thing, right? So in other words, if time was an illusion, it would require time to deceive someone into thinking that time existed if it didn't. You can see how that totally just, falls apart on itself, right? In other words, time cannot be an illusion because it would require time to create the illusion of time. So I think that's shown from at least three distinct angles, or three, very strong angles, that basically time must be real, time must exist, God must exist in time, and God cannot exist outside of time, because the whole concept of something being outside of time just is an invalid concept, right? It doesn't actually work. It doesn't make sense. And so, anyways, again, like I said, there's going through the reasoning of this requires lots of thinking and logic and what may be considered to be, philosophy or theoretical thinking and so on. But again, our purposes here are strictly practical. It's necessary to understand all that, or at least it's very helpful to understand all that, so that we don't have these kind of subconscious things of, oh, God's just so incomprehensible and outside of time and space. And when we think like that, even though we think, oh, God's a personal God, there's a disconnect there. And even if we aren't realizing it, it subconsciously affects how we approach God, right? And with that, we end up having less personal relationships with God. There are whole other sections of this that we're not going to get into in this video, of how this negatively affects people's thinking. I'll just mention now, one whole kind of branch of this is not just God's relation to time, but God's relation specifically to the future. And there's a lot of practical things that come in there, and it has to do with even just God's relation to time. If you really think about it, you can see how it affects intercessory prayer, right? Which I won't go all into right now, but basically, if the future already existed, and if if things were static, God created time and the rest of it, if that was the case, then me praying for anyone isn't going to change anything. There's no free will, nothing's, everything's already set. There can be no actual change, right? So subconsciously, when we think things like God created time, subconsciously we have kind of all these things that create a barrier between us and God that prevents us from having a real personal relationship. And that's why it's important to understand. So hopefully, it wasn't too theoretical and too philosophic, but again, sometimes it's necessary to go through that, and it's good too. It's good to think. It's good to think rationally. It's a good. Our brains should be working, right? So, anyways, I just hope that you are all willing to consider these things, and if you have any thoughts or comments in relation to this, please, feel free to write a comment or send me a message, or we can discuss this. There's, again, a lot of things that come off of this that relate to this, but that's not what this video is necessarily about. So Blessings to you all, and shalom.